This week, we will hear about two women who worked in the General Conference headquarters in the early part of the 20th century, Grace D. Mace and Lottie E. Quinn. 103 years ago, on July 9, 1920, Grace D. Mace attended the Home Missionary Convention for North America as a delegate to the convention. As the office secretary of the Home Missionary Department, Grace was well prepared for the gathering, which discussed ways for mission work at home, as well as ways to increase lay evangelism in local churches. Grace Derlin was born in the United States in Sigourney, Iowa on June 7, 1875, to John and Flora Derlin. In 1884, she and her sister Lottie accompanied their parents to England while her father labored in the church's new British mission. They were there approximately 5 years. While living in Battle Creek, Michigan, Grace worked as a secretary to John Harvey Kellogg, then Uriah Smith and George C. Tenney, and then to Sarepta Henry. After Mrs. Henry's death, Grace continued to work for the International Tract and Missionary Society, during which time she met Joseph W. Mace, whom she married in 1900. In 1906, the Maces were called to South Bend, Indiana, where Joseph was manager of the branch office of the Review and Herald Publishing Association. They labored together there until 1917, when Joseph was called to manage the Review and Herald's book department in their main office in Tacoma Park, Washington, D.C. 2 years after their arrival, Grace began working as the office secretary of the General Conference's Home Missionary Department, which existed to promote mission at home. She remained in this role until 1924, when she began working as the recording secretary for the Ministerial Association. In 1931, she returned to the Home Missionary Department as its office secretary, and in 1937, a year after Joseph died, Grace became the assistant secretary, equivalent to today's assistant director of the department, a role she held until her retirement in 1947. During her time as assistant secretary, Grace developed and advocated Dorcas welfare work. Grace died on October 11, 1968, having served the Seventh-day Adventist Church for 50 years. Almost 9 months after Grace's death, but 54 years ago this week, Grace's younger sister Lottie died in their home in Tacoma Park on July 9, 1969. Lottie was born September 2, 1878, also in Iowa. After she graduated from Battle Creek College, Lottie married Roland D. Quinn in 1898. The Quinns briefly took up self-supporting mission work in Salt Lake City, Utah, and then transferred to the state of Montana. In 1904, the Quinns were called to Australia, where they served in Queensland and Tasmania. In 1907, they returned to Montana, and Roland became the conference president. Lottie became the Montana Conference Secretary in 1908. In 1910, the Quinns moved to the Greater New York Conference, where Lottie became secretary of the Sabbath School Department. Lottie held this role until 1912, when she became the Missionary Volunteer Secretary for the Atlantic Union Conference. In 1920, when Roland became a General Conference Field Secretary and the couple moved to Maryland, Lottie began working in the GC Sabbath School Department as a stenographer and secretary, working under the direction of Flora Plummer, the departmental secretary. Roland's health collapsed in 1923, and so the couple moved to California for his health. After he died in 1928, Lottie moved back to Maryland, where she lived with Grace and Joseph. She compiled and published a small booklet titled Quiet Thoughts for Meditation in 1930, and she soon reconnected with the work of the GC's Sabbath School Department. You can see her here with the rest of the Sabbath School Department staff in 1938. Lottie Quinn worked in the headquarters until 1945. The church's work is done by far more people than just the well-known names. In fact, the work of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is accomplished through God's power with people like Grace and Lottie. May we all be totally involved in the fields that God places us in.